In the earliest morning hours on October 9th, 1995, 59 miles southwest of Phoenix, Amtrak train derailed in a clear act of sabotage, killing one person and injuring 78 others. Nearly 30 years later, the case is still unsolved. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, Art and Crime, where I share with you true crime cases while painting a piece related to the case. As a writer, artist, and true crime junkie, I combine my passions into one right here in hopes to help bring more exposure to certain cases or widely needed social commentary. Before we get started today, it's just some content warning for today's case. There's only a couple of them, but it is quite the doozy. Acts of terrorism, train crash, and a body being pinned and crushed to death. If any of these can be triggering to you, please feel free to click out of the video and I'll catch up with you next time. Now, for our case. The Sunset Limited is a historic name in railroading. For years, it was Southern Pacific's Los Angeles to New Orleans route. In April 1993, just a few years before this incident, the route was extended to Miami, making the Sunset Limited the nation's first regularly scheduled transcontinental passenger train not requiring a change of trains. The trip normally took 68 hours if you were to go from coast to coast. It ran 3,066 miles through 8 different states, stopping in 50 different places. However, passengers who started on this fateful trip in Miami made it only to Jacksonville at first, where hurricane damage forced a transfer to buses for the next stretch. The train consisted of two locomotives and 12 cars. The train was nearing the end of its trip as it traveled through the southwest of Arizona. 59 miles past Phoenix, the Sunset Limited went through a remote part of the desert in an area called Buckeye. Although today Buckeye is the largest geographical town in Phoenix, it's still mostly desert and is still considered the outskirts. As many of you know, I lived in Arizona for 20 years, and I lived in the northeast part of Phoenix in an area called Scottsdale. But I'm very familiar with the Buckeye area. I sold homes in the area and have friends that live there. And it's still very remote. And really the only parts of Buckeye that's been populated is just the ones closer to town. It's a big area. It goes behind the White Mountains, and it is still mostly desert, even 30 years later. And you're taking into consideration that Phoenix is one of the fastest growing cities in the United States. So even with that, Buckeye today is still remote. And the area that this happened in to this day is still very remote. 268 passengers were on the train. Most of them at this time were very likely asleep. The train had departed Phoenix just an hour and a half before, just before midnight. So most likely they had already fallen asleep. I know when I've taken the red eye on airplanes before, half the time people are asleep before the plane even takes off. So I assume that on the train this was probably the case as well, especially if the passengers had been taking the train since the very beginning in Miami. Uh, so 20 of those 268 passengers were employees. The train was traveling between 45 and 50 miles per hour. Luann Zawalski was one of the passengers. She had boarded the train in Texas, and she said she was asleep across two chairs when there was a sudden large jolt that threw her to the floor. As an LA resident, she described it as being shook to your feet like an earthquake. Uh, I I've experienced really bad earthquakes before. Um, we were in the Northridge earthquake. We've lost a house in the Northridge earthquake, and I'm not quite sure what this reference means. I think what she means is that if you're like in a bad earthquake, you get jolted and you just jump to your feet because you're startled. But that's just an assumption. Uh, Patricia Borey was the only dispatch in the area in Buckeye. She said it was a very quiet night, and the crash was so far from any population center that police, fire, and federal authorities had to be flown to the area to begin their investigation. It took 45 minutes for the first of the emergency responders to even arrive. And she talks about it here. I'm going to slip in a audio of her discussing what they had to do to get these responders to effectively help the passengers on the train crash.
Stage everybody all along the route to direct all the ambulances out to where the scene was. And we had to contact farmers that had road graders to grade the road out towards the railroad track, grade out an area for a trauma center. Ended up contacting Luke Air Force Base to get their mobile trauma unit to respond, because we had no idea what kind of injuries we were going to have or anything.
It was pitch dark, there was no electricity, and in the remote desert area, everyone was scrambling to bring light to the area so rescue workers could see. A dozen helicopters were used to carry the injured to hospitals in Phoenix. The first 8 cars behind the locomotives derailed. Somehow, the engine made it across the bridge. A baggage car, a transition dormitory car, 2 sleepers, a diner, lounge, and 2 coaches went off the tracks. The remaining 4 cars located at the rear did not derail. 4 of them lurched off the tracks and into the wash 30 feet below. And if you're not familiar with washes in Arizona, they're most of the time they are dry beds. These washes are more for storm times. When there's a storm, there's a lot of flash flooding in Arizona, and these dry beds and washes that's where the water will collect and go, and then they obviously turn into kind of raging rivers at this time. But at this time during the crash, it was a dry bed. So at least fortunately there was that. There was no water in there. I can imagine it probably would have been so much worse than what it was if there was water in there. And the lead car, the first one, smashed into a 2-foot thick abutment, gouging a huge hole into the concrete. That was how bad the impact of the crash was. 41-year-old Mitchell Bates, sleeping car attendant, was killed in the crash when his body was pinned between 2 cars. Helen Martinez, a friend of his and a waitress on the train, remembers his final words just before he went to bed Sunday night. He said, "See you tomorrow, baby doll." 78 people were injured, including young children. There was babies on board as young as 9 months old. There was a 3-year-old that was flown to the Phoenix hospital, admitted. Fortunately, those 78 people did recover physically. I'm sure their emotional scars probably linger till this day. Brian Jenkins, a counterterrorism expert, called the train crash a classic case of sabotage and said this type of derailing goes back to the Spanish Civil War and beyond. He also said trains are terribly vulnerable and there are any number of guerrilla manuals describing how to derail them. This is so insane to me. I didn't research or try to search for these manuals for multiple reasons. I just don't want to, I'm not an expert on algorithms, but I assume if I search for it and find it, it's just going to make it easier for other people to search and find it. And I already have enough questionable things in my Google search to add this to the list of things. But it's just crazy to me that there is such an easy way to find how to do something like this, and um, just, how to do a train for dummies, basically, is what this kind of suggests to me. A note was found at the scene under a rock. The way I read this, and I tried to find several sources, unfortunately and shockingly, there is not much on this case in general. Thank goodness for newspapers.com, because I was able to go back to when this happened to read articles. But it's just insane to me that literally an act of terrorism, there's very little known about it. I mean, it's just so insane to me. Like I said, I lived in Arizona for 20 years. I hadn't even heard of this case until recently, ironically, after I moved out of Arizona. So, I had to go back to read several articles. There's nothing much on it, and there's not much that describes the way this note was found, but it seems like this might have been placed near where the train was going to crash. Like, it wasn't actually on the train. That's how I read it. If you know any different, then by all means, please clarify in the comments, because I find that very interesting. I find it interesting either way. I mean, it may not seem like a big deal, but that does, to me, indicate quite a bit. I'm leaning towards it was found under a rock near where the crash site was, because otherwise that would mean that whoever did this was on the train, which I think would be something we would know by now. But again, I could not find any clarity on this, which alone kind of is confusing to me. But hopefully somebody has figured it out. But the note that was found, it refers to the 1992 FBI siege at Ruby Ridge, which I discussed in a previous video. I will link it at the end of this, and I will also put it in the comments below, or the description below. And it also discussed, and it also was signed the Sons of Gestapo. Anti-government domestic terrorists already had taken bloody revenge on April 19th, 1995, just a few short months before this train crash, by bombing a federal building in Oklahoma City, killing 168 people in a scheme that had actually been hatched in Arizona. I did not know that until I actually researched this case, that had started in Arizona. Granted, the Oklahoma City bombing is one I have not done a deep dive into. For me, it's really difficult to do research on cases that involve a lot of children, but it is something I do want to discuss and look into one day, and especially since all these seem to be linked together around the same time. So with the note being signed the Sons of Gestapo and referencing the siege, it also referenced the Oklahoma City bombing. Well, that would imply that they're striking again with this train crash. The problem was, no one had ever heard of any such outfit called the Sons of Gestapo. Not the FBI, not any of the civil rights organizations that keep a close watch on homegrown American hate groups. Nobody. Officials to this day believe that the Sons of Gestapo was a red herring. The sheriff at the time, Sheriff Joe Arpaio, very controversial sheriff who I probably can do a whole series on. Even he said he didn't know anything about the Sons of Gestapo. As much as I have feelings about this sheriff, one thing I will say is I do believe that if there was something like this in the area, he would know about it. And he even said that he'd never heard of it. And I think it's because of that, and even now to this day, officials have come out 25 years later saying that they don't think that this was a real thing. Federal officials said investigators discovered some spikes had been removed from the track and that a wire had been rigged to prevent a warning from going off. So you have your fail-safe measures in place. So if something like this happens, you have warning signs and things that would happen to prevent a crash, and even those had been removed. You needed only the very basic knowledge or wherewithal to research to know how to do this. You didn't need to be an expert in trains to pull this off. And unfortunately, what this means is that your pool of suspects is everyone. You can't narrow it down to train experts or employees or somebody who would know something about this, because really anybody could read into this, learn about it, and pull it off. Amtrak president at the time, Thomas Downs, told a news conference that a 36-inch steel bar used to connect two 39-foot sections of rail had been removed, and an electrical wire was placed between two sections of rail. That was a wire that kept warning signals from going off. Downs said it was obvious someone intended to drop the train off the trestle into the ravine, which is exactly what happened. It is a federal felony. It's punishable up to 20 years in prison to derail or wreck a train in interstate commerce. And if death results from the crime, which it did, the death penalty can be imposed, which is still in effect in Arizona. And there is no expiration on this. So if this person was caught today, they could still be charged and tried. And the death penalty can still be imposed. In the investigation was the FBI evidence teams with over 90 agents investigating. According to the FBI, that's an incredibly large amount of agents investigating one case. Amtrak investigators, the National Transportation Safety Board, the Federal Railroad Administration, local authorities, local officials like the Sheriff's Department, and the Southern Pacific Railroad, which owns, maintains, and dispatches trains. None of them to this day have found out what happened. No suspects have been named to this day. With as many people as investigating and officials have been investigated, they seem to have gotten absolutely nowhere with it. Oddly, a magazine for railroad buffs had recently published an article, and recently as in recently before the crash, about a 1939 passenger train crash in the remote Nevada desert that had been attributed to similar methods of sabotage. That crash killed 24 people. No one was ever arrested. So logically, for me, I would say that whoever did this to the Sunset Limited very likely might have read this article. And that's exactly what the authorities thought as well. After the Arizona derailment, agents interviewed people who had subscribed to that train magazine. But according to them, that investigation led nowhere. Nearly 30 years later, nothing else has been heard of that we know of the Sons of Gestapo. I found no mention of it in articles, and again, officials don't believe that this was a real group. They don't believe this is a real anti-government group. And so I don't know if that means they're just going off the fact that there's been nothing done since then with them signing their names off that way, or if they know something more about this, that they're saying it's not the Sons of Gestapo. I'm leaning towards the first part. That is because there's been no other cases since then using that name, signature name, instead of the fact that the officials actually have a little information on this case and what happened to be able to determine that. Unfortunately, I will speak more on it towards the end, what I think, but clearly I don't think they know much. Jill McCabe, spokeswoman for the Phoenix FBI office, said that this is still being investigated by the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force as an act of domestic terrorism. And that implies that the FBI believed there was an ideological motive behind the sabotage. According to McCabe, the FBI defines domestic terrorism as a violent criminal act committed by individuals and or groups to further ideological goals stemming from domestic influences such as those of a political, religious, social, racial or environmental nature. So the Oklahoma City bombing would absolutely fall under this, and they're considering this as part of that as well. Amtrak still runs the Sunset Limited 3 days a week between New Orleans and Los Angeles with stops in Maricopa. Maricopa is a town in Maricopa County. Maricopa County is where Phoenix and Buckeye is. And the stretch from Miami to New Orleans, however, has been out of commission ever since Hurricane Katrina struck the South in 2005. I'm not laughing because it's funny. It's more of an ironic laugh because that means that earlier when I began with this being a coast to coast type of train, it spent more time not being a coast to coast train as it did being one. So that was more of an ironic laugh. I tend to laugh at very inappropriate moments. That was one of them. So what are my thoughts on this? My thoughts are that I agree that it is a domestic act of terrorism. But I think that I have questions. I want to know more about the connection between Arizona and the Oklahoma City bombing and where that was, and see if there's any connections to the Phoenix train. Like, I would want to know that. Did the people who started that in Arizona, did they have any connection to anyone who lived in this area? Because I personally think that whoever committed this crime was a local to the area. And I think the reason is because it's such a random area to pick. It is so remote, and you kind of have to know your way around to really get to this area. Like I said, I've lived in Phoenix for 20 years. I've sold real estate in the area, and if you get into these outskirts, when it gets dark, it's very confusing, and it's very easy to get turned around. And it's hard to see these tracks in there. And remember, they didn't have things like GPS back then. This is in 1995. This is when we were still using maps. So you couldn't use your GPS and say, here, turn left there. There you are. There's your tracks. And like I said, I lived in Arizona for 20 years. And even as far as last year, GPS wasn't that reliable when you got outside of Phoenix. So even GPS gets confused with the area. So for me, I think that's one reason it needs to be a local. I also think that while you didn't have to have any knowledge to commit this, I do think that the person who did this probably had some knowledge with trains or a fascination with trains. And to know, I didn't know that there's even such thing as a railroad enthusiast magazine. I mean, I guess logically it makes sense because there's a magazine for everything. But again, this is 1995. It's not like you're going there and Googling these types of things. You actually have to go and do research via paper and read these magazines and read these articles. And if you're in the Buckeye area, it's just not something, I don't know, it's just, the freeways weren't really built out at that time. I moved to the Phoenix area 10 years after this, and the freeways were just like this brand new thing that went around. So I really, really absolutely believe that it was somebody local, somebody who lived probably within a few miles of this area. I believe that they did have some sort of train knowledge or fascination, probably even had hobby trains. There's definitely a train, I guess you could say like a train group in Arizona. There's, McCormick Park, which is actually in Scottsdale, where they have a ton of these, like, it's really a fun place where you have these, a center of all these, like, not modern, model trains. And this thing is probably, I'm just guessing, but, uh, it's warehouse size and all these model trains. And there's these people that just volunteer and they work on these trains. And then you have locomotives in there, and it's a train park. And it's, you can tell it's by train enthusiasts, and it's been around for a while. So there's definitely a community of these people in Arizona. I don't think it would take much to figure out who was in this community back in 1995, who was maybe acting suspicious. And, of course, I'm just some armchair YouTuber who's saying my opinion. Meanwhile, you have 90 plus FBI agents, all these people investigating. I'm sure they've explored all these avenues. But that's why I'm also saying that I think that they know more than they're letting on, which makes sense, right? It's very common for officials to keep things close to the sleeve, at the cuff. I forgot the phrase. At the cuff, to the sleeve, to the chest. I need another cup of coffee. But I think that they probably know more and they're just not sharing it. With that said, I really think that some of this information needs to be released because it'll be 30 years next year. We still have somebody who was killed and their family probably wants answers. Mitchell's family deserves answers. You have 70 plus people who probably relive this accident over and over to this day who deserve answers. Locals deserve answers. We all deserve answers. This was somebody who committed a huge crime. With that said, I don't think that it was anybody who really was trying to send a political message out. I think it was more a crime of opportunity, as in, I don't know, my instincts are just telling me that this is more of somebody who just liked trains, wanted to see if they could do it, probably read that article and said, hey, I wonder if I can do that. Obviously, they did. And I almost even wonder if it was they didn't think they would be able to pull it off themselves, and probably thought that there was some other fail-safe methods in place. I don't know. With as much as they did to stop this from not being successful, then very likely they knew the outcome would happen. But I don't think it was a political message. I don't think it was any sort of domestic violence, domestic terrorism violence act like that. I think it was actually just somebody who has a very twisted, dark view on things and was really just trying to commit an act using what was happening at the time with the Oklahoma City bombings, with Waco, with the siege at Ruby Ridge, and really just trying to get away with it. So I'm going to throw in a clip here that talks a little bit about what happened that day.
Rumors have swirled about what was found at the scene. Luann's 35mm camera captured a metal tool left near the point of derailment. She gave us a duplicate she had of that photo, but asking the FBI about specifics can be frustrating as a journalist.
I had read something about a pry bar or a crowbar being found at the scene and possibly missing from a volunteer fire department nearby. Is that credible?
There are a lot of rumors, and again, I don't want to get into those rumors because some of them actually could relate to do relate to the active investigation.
Was there ever something missing from a fire department, though, in the area?
That's something I can't speak to.
Let me know what you guys think of that clip and your thoughts on what happened on that fateful day. Do you think it was an act of terrorism, of somebody trying to get out their ideological theories, or do you think it was more what I believe, which is maybe a disgruntled employee or somebody local just getting their kicks off? If it's something as big as terrorism, then I think that we need to be told more information, and hopefully this helps spread the word. Thank you for joining me. Leave comments below.